I didn't plan to tell them the truth that night, but the way my daughter-in-law looked at me across that dining table told me she already knew something was wrong. The turkey was still steaming, and the scent of rosemary and butter filled the house I had lived in for 32 years. My hands trembled slightly as I folded my napkin, though I kept my face calm. That was always my way, quiet, composed, even when my heart felt heavy. It was Thanksgiving, and my entire family was gathered under one roof. My son Daniel sat at the head of the table, laughing softly at something his younger sister Melissa had just said. His wife, Rachel, smiled politely, but her eyes kept drifting toward me. Not accusing, not angry, just searching, like she was waiting for something, like she could sense the weight I had been carrying for years. I remember thinking in that very moment, how long can a truth stay buried before it begins to breathe on its own? The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, or maybe it was just my conscience. I lifted my glass of water, but I didn't drink. My throat felt dry, like sandpaper. Across the table, Daniel reached for the mashed potatoes the same way he always had since he was a boy. Careful, gentle, almost apologetic, as if he didn't want to inconvenience anyone. That small gesture made my chest tighten, because the truth I had been hiding was not just about the past. It was about him, and the life he believed was his. But before that night, before the tension thickened in my own home, our lives had always seemed normal, warm even, predictable in the kind of way that brings comfort. I lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Ohio, in a 2-story house with pale blue shutters and a porch swing my late husband had installed 20 years ago. Every morning, I would wake up at 6, brew my coffee, and sit by the kitchen window while the sun stretched slowly over the maple trees in the yard. Routine had become my anchor after my husband, Thomas, passed away 8 years ago. Grief changes the rhythm of a house. Even the silence sounds different. Daniel used to visit every Sunday after church. He'd walk in without knocking, calling out, "Mom, you alive in here?" with that soft chuckle of his. Rachel usually followed behind him, carrying a pie or a casserole dish, her heels clicking gently against the wooden floor. She was a good woman, kind, observant, the kind who noticed if your hands shook when you poured tea. Melissa, on the other hand, was more direct. My daughter had inherited her father's sharp tongue and quick instincts. She loved fiercely, but she questioned everything. And then there was me, the keeper of a secret that had quietly shaped our entire family. Back then, before the tension began, our Sundays were simple. We'd eat roast chicken, talk about work, complain about grocery prices, and laugh at old family stories. Sometimes Rachel would help me in the kitchen, drying dishes while humming softly under her breath. "Your house feels peaceful," she told me once, about 2 years after she married Daniel. I smiled at her and said, "Peace takes practice." What I didn't say was that peace also takes silence. Lots of silence. Daniel worked as an architect, always buried in blueprints and deadlines, but he never forgot to call me on Wednesdays, always at 7:12 p.m., not 7:10, not 7:15, that exact time, a habit he'd kept since college. "I just like knowing you're okay," he would say, and every time my heart would ache a little, because he trusted me completely, and trust, once given by a child to a parent, is the purest thing in the world. Rachel was the one who slowly began to notice the small things, the way I avoided certain old photo albums, the way I changed the subject whenever Daniel asked about his early childhood, the way my smile would stiffen whenever someone mentioned family history. At first, she said nothing, just watched, just listened. One evening, about 3 months before that Thanksgiving dinner, I shaved behind after Daniel left to take a phone call outside. I was wiping the kitchen counter when I felt her presence beside me. "You know," she said gently, "Daniel doesn't look like anyone in the family." I froze for half a second. Then I laughed softly, too softly. "He looks like himself," I replied. She nodded, but her eyes didn't leave my face. That was the first moment I felt the ground beneath my carefully built silence begin to shift. After that, little questions began appearing like quiet cracks in glass. Where was Daniel born again? Do you have hospital pictures? Was Thomas there that day? Each question was asked politely, respectfully, never accusing, but each one landed directly on the secret I had protected for over 30 decades. I told myself she was just curious. I told myself it would pass. But secrets have a strange way of reacting to curiosity. They grow heavier and louder. Then, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, I walked into the living room and found Rachel holding an old photo box I had not opened in years. Her fingers rested on a single envelope, and the look on her face told me something had already begun to unravel. That was the moment I realized the truth was no longer just mine to hide. Rachel did not open the envelope when I walked into the room. She simply held it in both hands, as if it were something fragile or sacred. The late afternoon light filtered through the curtains and fell softly across her face, and for a brief second, I saw hesitation in her eyes. Not suspicion, not judgment, just concern. "Oh," she said quietly, almost apologetically. "I was looking for the board game box. I didn't mean to go through your things." I forced a small smile and stepped forward, my slippers barely making a sound on the hardwood floor. "That old box?" I said gently. "It's just full of memories, nothing interesting." That was my first lie to her, and I remember it clearly because it tasted bitter the moment it left my mouth. She nodded and carefully placed the envelope back into the box, without opening it. That small act of respect should have comforted me. Instead, it unsettled me, because it told me something about Rachel. She was not impulsive. She was patient, the kind of person who waited for truth instead of forcing it out. And patience, when directed toward a secret, is far more dangerous than confrontation. Life continued as it always had after that day, at least on the surface. Mornings still began with coffee and the soft hum of the refrigerator. I still watered the plants on the porch, still folded laundry while the local news murmured in the background, still set an extra plate in the cabinet out of habit, a quiet relic from the years when Thomas was alive. But beneath those routines, something had shifted inside me. Every small interaction began to feel heavier. When Daniel called on Wednesdays, his voice warm and familiar, I found myself listening more closely than usual. "How's my favorite woman doing?" he would say playfully. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I always replied. And I meant it. Mostly. Daniel had always been a gentle child. Even as a boy, he was observant in ways most children were not. He noticed when I was tired, when I skipped meals, when I forced a smile during difficult days. I still remember one winter morning when he was 8 years old. I had burnt the toast because my mind was elsewhere, buried in worries I never voiced. He quietly scraped off the charred edges and said, "It still tastes okay, Mom." That was Daniel. He made peace with things he didn't fully understand. Melissa, however, was the opposite. My daughter visited less frequently, but when she did, the house felt louder, sharper, more alive. She hugged tightly, spoke directly, and never pretended not to notice tension. About a month before Thanksgiving, she came over on a Sunday afternoon, her boots still dusty from the cold outside. She walked into the kitchen, kissed my cheek, and leaned against the counter while I stirred a pot of soup. "You've been distracted lately," she said casually. I kept stirring. "Have I?" "Yes," she crossed her arms, "and Rachel's been asking questions." The spoon paused in my hand. "What kind of questions?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "The usual," she shrugged. "Family stuff, old stories, childhood things." She asked me where Daniel was born. My heartbeat slowed in a strange, heavy way. "And what did you say?" I asked. Melissa tilted her head slightly, steadying me. "I said the hospital in Columbus, like you always told us." The soup bubbled softly between us, filling the silence. Then she added more quietly, "Mom, is there something you've never told us?" That question lingered in the air like steam rising from the pot. I turned off the stove and wiped my hands on a towel, buying myself a few seconds. "Every family has things they don't talk about," I replied. She didn't argue, she didn't push, but she didn't look convinced either. That night, after she left, I sat alone in the living room and stared at the old photo box Rachel had found. It rested on the bottom shelf of the cabinet, untouched, yet suddenly louder than anything else in the house. Inside that box were hospital bracelets, old letters, documents I had folded and refolded so many times the edges had softened. Proof. Proof of a truth that could rearrange the way my children saw their entire lives. I had always told myself I was protecting them, protecting Daniel, protecting our family's peace, protecting a promise I made long ago. But as the weeks passed, Rachel's presence in the house began to feel different. Not intrusive, not suspicious, just attentive. She started observing details no one else noticed. One evening, she watched Daniel flip through an old album and pause. "Mom," he said, smiling faintly, "why are there no pictures of me as a newborn? Melissa has tons." I laughed lightly, too lightly. "Oh, cameras weren't always around back then," I replied. Rachel didn't speak, but I could feel her gaze shift toward me. And that was when the questions stopped being casual. They became quiet observations, careful silences. Then a week before Thanksgiving, Rachel returned alone one afternoon with a container of homemade soup. She placed it on the counter, removed her coat, and stood there longer than usual. "I hope you don't mind, but I stopped by the county records office yesterday." My fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "I've been researching family history," she continued gently. "Just curiosity." The clock on the wall ticked loudly. "And?" I asked. She hesitated. Then she said something that made my chest feel hollow. "I couldn't find Daniel's original birth registration under your name in the year you mentioned." The room went very still, and for the first time in 32 years, someone had stepped directly onto the truth I had buried. The words didn't sound accusatory. That was what made them heavier. Rachel stood there quietly, her hands folded in front of her, her voice gentle, almost careful, as if she were handling something fragile instead of speaking about my son's birth. "I'm probably mistaken," she added softly. "Records can be incomplete or filed differently." I nodded, once, slowly. "Yes," I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. "Records can be complicated." But inside, something had begun to fracture. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet crack spreading beneath years of silence. She didn't press me after that. She didn't demand explanations or raise her voice. Instead, she simply changed the subject and asked about the soup simmering on the stove, complimented the smell of thyme, and spoke about Daniel's busy week at work. And that restraint unsettled me more than any confrontation ever could, because it meant she was thinking, watching, connecting pieces. After she left that afternoon, the house felt unusually quiet. Even the ticking clock sounded sharper, as if marking each second of my hesitation. I walked to the cabinet, opened it, and took out the photo box with trembling hands. The envelope inside was still sealed, yellowed with time, soft at the corners. I held it for a long moment without opening it, my thumb brushing over the crease I had folded decades ago. Memories rose slowly, not as clear images, but as sensations. The smell of antiseptic, the weight of a tiny blanket, the echo of a promise whispered in a hospital room. "I will raise him as my own." Those were the words I had spoken, and I had kept them for 32 years. That evening, Daniel called at exactly 7:12 p.m., just like always. "Hey, Mom," he said warmly. "Rachel told me she dropped by earlier. You doing okay?" "Yes, sweetheart. She brought soup. It was thoughtful." He chuckled softly. "That sounds like her. She worries about people." There was a pause on the line, the kind filled with unspoken things. Then he said, casually, "She's been on this family history kick lately, asking a lot of questions." My heart tightened. "Oh?" I asked lightly. "Yeah," he laughed. "I even asked me why I don't look like Dad in any old photos, said my nose is different." I smiled into the silence, though he couldn't see it. "You have your own features," I said gently. "Guess so," he replied. "But it's funny, I was looking at childhood albums last week. There's this gap, like no hospital pictures, no newborn shots. Melissa has tons." My grip on the phone tightened just slightly. "Cameras weren't always around back then," I repeated, the same explanation I had used before. He didn't question it. He never did. "That makes sense," he said easily. "You always kept things simple." That sentence stayed with me long after the call ended. You always kept things simple. If only he knew how much complexity had been hidden behind that simplicity. In the days that followed, I noticed small changes in Rachel's behavior. Nothing obvious, nothing disrespectful, just attentive silence. At Sunday dinner, she watched more than she spoke. When Daniel told childhood stories, she listened carefully, her eyes shifting between us. When Melissa mentioned family traits, Rachel tilted her head slightly, as if mentally filing away every detail. One afternoon, I found her standing in front of the hallway wall where all our family photos were framed. She wasn't touching them, just observing. "That one was taken when Daniel was 5, she said softly, pointing to a picture of him holding a toy truck. "Yes," I replied. "He looks a little different there," she continued. I walked closer. My chest felt heavy. "Children change as they grow," I said. She turned to me slowly. "Did you have a difficult pregnancy with him?" The question was gentle, but precise. I swallowed. "Every pregnancy is different." Another pause. Then she nodded, as if respecting an invisible boundary. But the questions did not stop. They only became quieter, more thoughtful. A few days later, Melissa called me unexpectedly. "Mom," she said without greeting, "Rachel asked me something strange today." My stomach tightened. "What did she ask?" "She asked if you ever lived anywhere else other than Ohio before Daniel was born." The air felt smaller. "And what did you say?" I told her no. Then her voice lowered. "But Mom, I checked some old paperwork at home. Your old address from that year wasn't Ohio. It was listed as a short-term residence in Pennsylvania." The air left my lungs slowly. I closed my eyes. "I had to travel briefly," I said carefully. "For 9 months?" Melissa asked quietly. Silence filled the space between us. Not angry silence, not dramatic silence, just the kind that forms when truth stands very close but remains unspoken. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room with only the lamp on, the photo box open beside me. For years, I had convinced myself that love was enough to bury the past, that raising a child with devotion erased the circumstances of his beginning. But secrets don't disappear. They wait, they observe, they grow heavier with every passing year. Then, 3 nights before Thanksgiving, Daniel and Rachel came over unexpectedly. And this time, Rachel wasn't just observing. She was holding a document in her hand. When I opened the door that evening, I knew something had changed. Not because of what Rachel said, but because of how quietly Daniel stood behind her. He usually greeted me with a hug, a smile, some small joke about my cooking or the weather. That night, he simply stepped inside, kissed my cheek gently, and walked into the living room without saying much. Rachel followed, holding a manila folder close to her chest. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon from the tea I had just brewed. The lamp in the corner cast a soft yellow glow, and for a brief moment, everything looked normal, but the air felt heavier, denser, like a storm waiting politely before it begins. "I'm sorry for coming unannounced," Rachel said softly as she removed her coat. "You never need permission to visit," I replied automatically, though my voice sounded distant even to my own ears. Daniel sat on the couch, his hands clasped loosely, staring at the framed family photos across the room. He looked thoughtful, not upset, not yet. Rachel remained standing for a moment longer. Then she placed the folder on the coffee table between us. "She found something," she said gently. No accusation, no raised voice, just truth presented quietly. I lowered myself into the armchair across from them, my hands folded in my lap to hide their trembling. "What did you find?" I asked. She hesitated before opening the folder, as if giving me one final chance to speak first. When I didn't, she slid a document toward me. It was a copy of a hospital record, dated 32 years ago, but not from the hospital I had always mentioned. "This record shows a newborn male delivered in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania," she said softly, "on the same date as Daniel's birthday." My vision blurred for a second, but I kept my posture steady. Daniel finally spoke. "Mom," he said quietly, "you told us I was born in Columbus." His voice wasn't angry, it was confused, and that hurt far more. I picked up the paper slowly, even though I already knew what it contained. The ink, the hospital seal, the physician's signature, all details I had memorized long ago. "I traveled briefly that year." Rachel's voice remained calm. "The record doesn't list you as the birth mother." The room went silent, so silent that I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Daniel's head lifted slowly. "What does that mean?" he asked, looking between us. Rachel didn't answer immediately. She looked at me first, giving me space, giving me dignity, and that kindness nearly broke me. "There's more," she said carefully, sliding another paper forward. "Documents for adoption processing, filed 3 weeks after the birth." Daniel leaned forward slightly, his brow tightening. "Adoption?" he repeated. The word hung in the air like something fragile and irreversible. My hands rested in my lap, but I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. 32 years. 32 years of silence. And now the truth sat on my coffee table in printed ink. "I wasn't searching to hurt anyone," Rachel continued gently. "I was building a family history file, but the records didn't match the timeline we've always been told." Daniel looked at me again, his eyes searching my face the same way they had when he was a child trying to understand something complicated. "Mom," he said softly, "is this wrong? Or is there something you never told us?" There it was. Not accusation, not anger, just a question filled with trust. And trust, once placed in front of the truth, becomes unbearably heavy. I opened my mouth, but no words came. Because in that moment, I wasn't just facing my son. I was facing every decision I had made in silence. Rachel spoke again, her tone still respectful. "There's one more detail," she said, sliding another paper forward. The biological mother's name was sealed, but there was a note attached to the file. Emergency guardianship transfer to a relative. Daniel blinked slowly. "A relative?" he repeated. His voice was quieter now, more fragile. "Yes," Rachel said. Then she paused. "And the address listed for the guardianship application matches the temporary residence Melissa mentioned, the one in Pennsylvania." The ticking clock on the wall sounded unbearably loud. Daniel leaned back slightly, as if the ground beneath him had shifted in a way he couldn't yet understand. "You were in Pennsylvania the year I was born," he said, looking directly at me now. I nodded once. "Yes." Another silence filled the room, longer this time, deeper. Then he asked the question I had feared for over 3 decades. "Mom," he said, "did you adopt me?" My chest tightened and my throat burned, but I still didn't answer immediately, because the truth was not simple. It was not just adoption. It was love. It was loss. It was a promise made in a hospital room to someone who could not stay. And before I could gather the courage to speak, Rachel gently placed one final paper on the table, a handwritten note, old, faded, familiar, my handwriting. Daniel picked it up slowly, and as his eyes moved across the words, his expression changed. Daniel's fingers trembled slightly as he held the note. I recognized the paper instantly. The soft creases, the faint ink smudge near the bottom where my hand had once shaken. I had written those words in a hospital waiting room, long before he ever called me Mom. He read it silently at first, then, barely above a whisper, he began to read aloud. I promise to love him as my own. I will protect him, raise him, and never let him feel abandoned, no matter what happens. His voice faltered on the last sentence. The room felt unbearably still. He looked up at me, confusion clouding his eyes. You wrote this. It wasn't a question. It was a realization. Yes, I said quietly. Rachel sat beside him, not touching him, not interrupting, just present, just steady. I would always be grateful for that restraint. Daniel swallowed hard. Why would you write something like this unless... He stopped. His gaze drifted back to the adoption papers, then to the hospital record, then slowly, painfully back to me. You're not my birth mother, he said. Not accusing, not angry, just stating a truth he was still trying to understand. I inhaled slowly, my chest rising with a weight I had carried for 32 years. No, I answered softly. I am not the woman who gave birth to you. The words did not shatter the room the way I had always imagined they would. They settled instead. Heavy, quiet, final. Daniel blinked several times as if his mind was rearranging every childhood memory at once. But you're my mother, he said after a long pause. You raised me. You were there every day. Tears stung my eyes, but I kept my voice calm. Yes, I replied. I am your mother in every way that life allowed me to be. His jaw tightened slightly. Then why, he asked gently, did you never tell me? That question hurt more than any accusation could have, because the answer was not simple fear. It was love, mixed with guilt. I folded my hands together, grounding myself before speaking. Because the truth began with tragedy and a promise I made to someone who trusted me more than anyone else ever had. Rachel's eyes softened, but she remained silent. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Who? He asked. Who was my birth mother? My heart pounded once, heavily. Then I said the name I had not spoken aloud in years. Her name was Claire. The silence that followed was different. Not tense, not sharp, just deeply emotional. She was my younger sister, I continued. Daniel froze. Rachel's hand slowly covered her mouth. Melissa and I had an older sibling. Claire was 6 years younger than me. Gentle, sensitive, always searching for approval. My voice softened as memory surfaced. She got involved with a man who left when she told him she was pregnant. She was only 21, scared, alone, and ashamed in ways I could see, but she never admitted. Daniel's eyes never left my face. She moved to Pennsylvania during her pregnancy, said she needed space, said she didn't want the family to know until she figured things out. I paused, steadying my breath. When I received the call from the hospital, she was already in labor. The memory rushed back with startling clarity. The smell of antiseptic, the hum of machines, the fragile look in Claire's eyes as she held a newborn wrapped in a pale blue blanket. She was very sick, I said softly. Complications the doctors hadn't expected. Rachel whispered, "Oh my God." I nodded slowly. She held you for less than an hour, I told Daniel, my voice trembling for the first time. Then she asked me to come closer. Daniel's eyes glistened now. She told me she couldn't raise you, not in the condition she was in, not with the future she knew she didn't have. My throat tightened, and she asked me one thing. Daniel leaned forward, almost afraid to hear it. What did she ask? He whispered. I closed my eyes briefly. She asked me to promise that you would never grow up feeling unwanted, that you would have a stable home, a real mother, a real life. The clock ticked quietly behind us. And I promised her, right there in that hospital room, that I would raise you as my own son. Daniel's breathing grew slower. She passed away 2 days later, I said. The words landed softly, but their weight filled the entire room. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. Daniel looked down at the note in his hands again. So you adopted me, but you never told anyone. I told your father, I replied gently. Thomas knew everything. He signed the guardianship papers with me. He loved you from the moment he held you. Daniel's lips parted slightly. Dad knew? He asked. Yes. Yes, I repeated gently. Your father knew from the very beginning. Daniel leaned back slowly, as if absorbing that detail required physical space. And Melissa? He asked after a moment. She was only 3 at the time, I said. We told her Claire had moved away. By the time she was old enough to ask real questions, the story had already settled into something simpler. Rachel finally reached for Daniel's hand. He didn't pull away, but his fingers felt stiff in hers. So my whole life, he said quietly, I believed something that wasn't true. The words weren't harsh, they were wounded. I nodded. Yes. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture he'd had since adolescence whenever he felt overwhelmed. Why didn't you tell me when I got older? When I turned 18? Or when Dad died? I swallowed. Because every year that passed made it harder, I admitted. At first, you were too young. Then you were a teenager, sensitive and searching for identity. Then college came and I didn't want to shake your foundation. And after your father passed, my voice softened. You were already grieving. I couldn't bear to add more. Daniel looked at the floor for a long time. I don't feel angry, he said slowly. I feel untethered. That word pierced me more than shouting ever could have. Untethered. Like something steady had quietly shifted beneath him. Rachel spoke gently. Daniel, she raised you. Nothing about that changes. He nodded faintly. I know. I do know that. Then he looked at me again. But you should have trusted me with the truth. The calmness in his tone carried more weight than accusation. You're right, I said. There was no defense left in me, only honesty. I thought I was protecting you, but in protecting you from pain, I denied you part of your own story. The room settled into a different kind of silence now. Not explosive, not volatile, just reflective. Rachel wiped at her cheek quietly. Does Melissa know now? Daniel asked. No, I said, not fully. She suspected something, but I never confirmed it. He nodded slowly, processing. And Claire, what was she like? The question surprised me. He wasn't asking about deception anymore. He was asking about her. I allowed myself a small, tender smile. She had your eyes, the same way they soften when you're thinking. She loved music, old vinyl records. She laughed with her whole body. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, as if trying to imagine her. I wish I'd known, he murmured. So do I replied. For years, I had told myself silence was kindness, But in that moment, I realized silence had also erased someone. Rachel squeezed his hand again. "We can find out more," she said gently. "There may be records, photos." I stood slowly and walked to the cabinet, retrieving the photo box. "This isn't everything," I said, setting it on the table. "But it's what I kept." Inside were a few photographs of Claire during her pregnancy, a small hospital bracelet, and one picture, slightly faded, of her holding a newborn wrapped in blue. Daniel picked it up carefully. "That's me," he whispered. "Yes," I said. His thumb brushed over Claire's face in the photograph. "She looks young," he said. "She was," I replied. The air felt softer now, sad, but no longer tense. Then Daniel asked something I hadn't expected. "Do you regret adopting me?" The question stunned me. I stepped closer without hesitation. "Never," I said firmly. "Not for 1 second. You are my son, not by blood, by every choice I made after." His eyes filled again, but this time the tears were different. Not confusion, not shock, just emotion. "I love you," he said quietly. "I love you too," I replied. Rachel exhaled softly, as if releasing tension she'd been holding for weeks. "I'm sorry for digging," she said gently. "I didn't mean to force this." I shook my head. Truth was coming whether we were ready or not. Daniel nodded slowly. "Melissa deserves to know," he said. I knew he was right, and that next conversation would be its own kind of reckoning. Because secrets do not unravel in isolation, they ripple outward. And by Thanksgiving, everyone would know. Thanksgiving morning arrived with a quiet stillness that felt almost unnatural. Usually, the day began with noise, the clatter of dishes, the hum of the oven, Melissa's early arrival with too many grocery bags, Daniel teasing her about bringing enough food for an army. But that morning, the house felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were aware that something long hidden was about to step into the light. I woke before sunrise, as I always did, and stood in the kitchen holding a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. Outside, the maple trees swayed gently in the late autumn wind, their leaves scattered across the yard like fragments of something that used to be whole. By noon, the house filled with familiar sounds. Melissa's voice echoed down the hallway, the oven timer chimed, footsteps moved across the wooden floors. But beneath it all, there was tension. Daniel arrived with Rachel, both quieter than usual. He hugged me when he walked in, longer than normal, and I felt the subtle shift in that embrace. Not distance, not rejection, just awareness. Melissa noticed it immediately. "Okay," she said, placing a pie on the counter and narrowing her eyes slightly. "Why does everyone look like they just attended a very serious meeting without me?" No one laughed, and that silence told her more than any explanation could. She turned toward me first. "Mom?" she asked. I set down the serving spoon slowly. "There is something we need to talk about," I said. The words felt steady leaving my mouth, but my hands trembled slightly against the edge of the table. Rachel gently guided Daniel to sit, and Melissa remained standing, arms crossed, her instincts already alert. "What kind of something?" she asked. Daniel inhaled deeply. "It's about me," he said quietly. Melissa blinked. "About you? What happened?" He glanced at me once, as if asking permission without speaking. I nodded. And in that moment, the secret that had lived silently in our home for 3 decades finally stepped into the open. "Mom adopted me," he said. The sentence landed softly, but its meaning rippled instantly. Melissa's expression didn't explode into shock the way I had feared. Instead, it shifted slowly, confusion first, then disbelief, then something deeper. "That's not funny," she said quietly. "I'm not joking. Daniel replied. Her gaze snapped toward me. Mom, she said, her voice low and controlled, is this true? I met her eyes. Yes. The room fell completely silent. Even the oven timer, which usually chimed every few minutes, seemed to hold its breath. You mean, she swallowed, you mean he's not your biological son? He is my son, but not by birth. Melissa took a step back, her hand covering her mouth as realization began to stitch itself together in her mind. Oh, the Pennsylvania address, the missing hospital photos, the way you always change the subject. Her eyes filled suddenly. Oh my God, Claire. Daniel's head lifted quickly. You knew? No, she said, shaking her head. I didn't know, but I remember her leaving. I remember the way Mom cried for weeks after. She looked at me again, tears forming now. You told me she moved away. She was very sick, I said softly. Melissa's voice trembled. She died, didn't she? Yes. That single word broke something open inside the room. Melissa sank into the nearest chair, stunned. And Daniel, she whispered, looking at him with new understanding. You're Claire's baby. He nodded slowly. The air between them changed instantly. Not distant, not awkward, just emotionally real. A brother she had always loved, now seen through a deeper truth. You should have told us, Melissa said quietly, her voice not angry but hurt. I know, I replied. Do you realize that you carried this alone for 32 years? I gave a small, tired smile. I thought I was carrying it for all of you. Daniel spoke gently. Instead, you carried it away from us. That distinction settled heavily in my chest. Finally, Rachel spoke, her tone calm and respectful. No one here was deceived out of cruelty. This was a promise made during grief. Melissa wiped her eyes slowly. I'm not angry, she said after a long pause. I'm just overwhelmed. This changes our story. Yes, but it does not change our bond. She looked at Daniel again, studying his face as if seeing traces of Claire for the first time. Then, quietly, she reached across the table and took his hand. You're still my brother. Daniel's voice softened. Always have been. And in that moment, the truth, instead of tearing us apart, began reshaping us into something more honest. Not perfect, not untouched, but real. For the first time in decades, the secret no longer belonged to just me. It belonged to the family. And strangely, the house felt lighter. The house was quiet that evening, long after the dishes were cleared and the last crumbs of pie had been eaten. Outside, the sun had dipped behind the maple trees, leaving the yard in soft shadows. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cinnamon and old wood, familiar, comforting, but now carrying the weight of truth. I sat in the armchair by the window, Daniel on the couch across from me, Melissa at his side, and Rachel sitting quietly beside him. No one spoke for a long time. We were all digesting, not just the facts, but the emotions they carried. Grief, relief, confusion, and strangely, a tentative sense of connection. Daniel finally broke the silence, his voice low and careful. I feel like I've been living two lives at once, the life I knew and the life I never knew. I nodded slowly, feeling the ache of every secret I had held, every lie I had told in the name of protection. Yes, I said softly, and the weight of that can feel heavy at first, but it doesn't take away from the life you've lived. You've been loved, truly, deeply. That's never changed. Melissa reached over and placed her hand over Daniel's. He's still our brother. Nothing about that changes. Her voice was firm, yet tender. The reassurance carried a quiet power, a recognition that family is more than biology, that bonds built through love cannot be undone by the revelation of hidden facts. Rachel finally spoke, her voice calm but steady. The truth can be heavy, but carrying it together makes it lighter. It's a step toward honesty, toward real peace. I looked at her and felt a swell of gratitude. She had approached this delicately, never rushing, never forcing the moment. Her compassion had allowed my children to face the truth without anger or resentment. Daniel leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. "It's strange," he murmured. "I thought learning the truth would make me feel betrayed, but I feel something else. I feel whole in a way I didn't know was missing." Tears pricked at my eyes. I had imagined anger, disbelief, even blame. But what I saw in Daniel was something quieter, deeper. The beginning of understanding, acceptance, and forgiveness. Melissa shifted in her seat, still holding his hand. "We can't change the past," she said, "but we can honor it. And we can honor Claire by remembering her, not as a shadow over our lives, but as a part of the love that brought Daniel to us." Her words settled over us like a balm. I felt my chest loosen, the tension I had carried for 32 years beginning to lift. I reached for the photo box and placed it gently on the coffee table. "These are all we have," I said softly. "Pictures, notes, reminders, that they also hold memories of her, of the promise I made all those years ago, and the life we built together." Daniel picked up the note I had written all those years ago, reading the familiar words once more. His thumb traced the inked letters. "You kept your promise," he said quietly, "every single day." "Yes," I whispered, feeling the weight of those decades lift slightly. "I did, and I will continue to." Rachel smiled faintly, looking at all of us. "Family isn't just what we're born into," she said. "It's what we protect, what we nurture, what we choose to love, even when it's difficult." Melissa nodded, squeezing Daniel's hand. "We choose each other," she said, "no matter what the truth is." The evening stretched on, filled with quiet conversations, gentle laughter, and the occasional sniffle. We talked about Claire, about the brief moments I had spent with her, and about the life she had hoped for her child. We shared memories, real and imagined, bridging the gap between the past and the present. For the first time in decades, I felt a sense of peace. Not perfection, not erasure of the years spent carrying secrets, but a fragile, growing sense that truth could coexist with love, that honesty could bring us closer instead of tearing us apart. Daniel finally stood and walked to the window, looking out at the yard where the autumn leaves swirled in the soft wind. "Mom," he said quietly, "thank you for everything, for Claire, for me, for all of it." I rose slowly and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've always been my son," I said softly, "and you always will be." Melissa joined me, wrapping her arms around both of us. Rachel placed a gentle hand on my back. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the people I loved most, I realized that even after secrets, even after loss, even after heartbreak, love had the power to heal. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. The house had grown quiet again after dinner, but this time it felt different. Not heavy, not tense, just calm. The kind of calm that comes after storms have passed, the silence filled with the knowledge that hearts have been seen, truths have been spoken, and love has endured. I sat in my favorite armchair, the photo box resting on the coffee table in front of me. Daniel had gone to his room, Melissa was tidying up the kitchen, and Rachel was gathering her things to leave. I took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the house, the lingering aroma of cinnamon and roasted turkey, the soft ticking of the clock that had witnessed so many years of our lives. It struck me in that quiet moment how fragile and beautiful family can be, how secrets, even well-intentioned, can shadow the ones we love, but also how truth, when shared with patience and compassion, can heal more than it harms. I thought about Claire, my sister, the mother who could not stay. I thought about the promise I made to her, a promise that guided every choice I made for Daniel. And I realized that carrying her memory, honoring it with honesty, had allowed us to grow closer, to understand one another more deeply, and to see that love is not only in birth, but in presence, in sacrifice, and in everyday care. Looking at the family photos on the wall, I felt a quiet gratitude. Gratitude for the love we share, for the resilience of my children, and for the grace of those who approach the truth gently, without blame. Life is never perfect, but it can be whole if we are willing to face the truth and embrace one another. And now I turn to you, dear listener. Families are filled with hidden stories, secrets, and unspoken truths. How would you handle the weight of a secret that could change everything? Would you keep it to protect those you love? Or would you speak it, risking the discomfort of revelation for the sake of honesty? Our choices define us, but our courage to embrace truth defines our families. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing and supporting our channel. Share your own stories in the comments. Your experiences, your reflections, and your courage might be the light someone else needs today. Because, in the end, love is stronger than secrets, stronger than fear, and stronger than the years we spend hiding from the truth.